So the title of the talk is Make Your Games Stand Out, Unique Music and Sound Effects for Games. So for a brief overview, so I'll give you a little introduction first, and then we're going to talk about enhancing the user experience, talk about specifically unique music, unique sound effects, unique implementation, and then we're going to go into a bunch of case studies, analyze them, see how they came about, and then we'll have time for a brief Q&A afterwards. So I'd like to talk about the goals for this talk. I'd like to educate you about the role of creativity in audio for games. I'd like to demonstrate uses of unique audio and how they enhance the game, provide ideas about how to utilize more unique assets in terms of implementation and the use of sound effects as well as music, and most importantly, improve the communication between the audio team and the designers, because that's where a lot of the collaboration takes place, is the back and forth between the two. So I guess Richard talked about this a little bit, a bunch of games, Diablo, VR games, but most importantly, my last name rhymes with car stereo. So Erik Desiderio, car stereo. We all know about boring assets. We've all played games where things are boring. This talk is about avoiding that, about making things really interesting so that people remember the game, they have the melody going through their head in the morning when they wake up, and they can't wait to jump back in and play the game. So let's talk about the inspiration for creating unique sounds, okay? So the first thing you want to start with is the theme of the game. What makes this game stand out from the rest? And how can we use different instruments and different musical styles to enhance that and make things stand out? So first you want to look at the concept art. What does the main character look like? What is he wearing? What is he dressed as? What do you think motivates his character? Think about the location of the game, but also be very specific about it. So say you have a forest, like is this like a jungle that's in South America, or is this a jungle in Africa? You're going to approach these two things differently with different types of percussion instruments depending on the location. You don't want to mix the two unless the client really doesn't care if you use a djembe for a South American thing. But generally, I try to keep things very specific to the actual location. And then you, of course, want to go with the direction from the art department and have a conversation with them about it. So first of all, I always focus on the instrumentation first. I always try using, I like to try using ethnic instruments in a non-ethnic instrument setting. I like to try non-ethnic instruments in an ethnic instrument setting. A lot of times, you think about musical style. What I do a lot of times, or try to do, is to cross styles and have instruments play rhythms that are generally associated with a different style of music than the instrument is associated with, and try to make that be a unique factor in the game. So like for example, one game I did Brazilian rhythms, but I did them on a banjo. And that for me actually was like a nice cue, a nice little hook that the audience could listen to, and they would hear it and they'd be like, what is that? That's a banjo, but it's playing this interesting rhythm that I haven't heard a banjo play before. So that's one approach that I use a lot. I feel like there's a lot of possibilities in terms of synth sounds and what you can do with those in terms of tweaking them. You can get a lot of interesting, unique things out of that. I always try to use vocal sounds because everyone has a different set of vocal cords, a different head shape, a different size. That's going to cause things to always sound unique, and no two people's vocal cords sound alike. In terms of sound effects, I always try to do unique processing of standard sounds. I'll talk a little bit more about Iris, which is this really amazing plugin where you can really sculpt the sound, take little parts of the sound and amplify those, and really change the way that things sound. And then talk about Foley and field recording to create original audio. I always try to avoid sound effects libraries. I always try to create my own sound effects if at all possible. That's one way that things will always sound unique. So let's take a look at Paco. Okay, this is the first example. He's Mexican, so he's wearing a sombrero. So the first thought that comes to mind is, hey, mariachi music. You know, that seems like a natural fit for him, right? Also, you know, he's a guitarist. You know, you might think about using flamenco music. Flamenco music is from Spain, but it's possible that Paco is a world traveler and he's traveled to Spain and he's picked up a few flamenco licks from Paco de Lucia or some other fantastic flamenco guitarist. So then you also look at the background. What else is going on there? So we have a desert, right? A desert, what do you associate with desert music? Is like, you know, calypso, Caribbean music? Well, what about, you know, spaghetti western theme? Like, you wouldn't think that a spaghetti western theme would work with this, right? Well,
in Old Town, south of the border, overrun with despair and depression. Only one man can set things right again. Time for fiesta!
So that's Paco and the Popping Peppers. It's a casino game, so I'll talk about that a little bit more. So first of all, in terms of the mariachi style, what makes music mariachi? I feel like the quintessential thing for that is the trumpets. They got to be playing the melody. They're playing in thirds, 2 trumpets, 3 trumpets. I tried that. It just does not sound like mariachi music anymore. And they have to be playing thirds. If they're playing unisons, it ends up sounding a little too epic, and it steers it away from the happy mariachi sound that everyone knows and loves. So also with this, we use nylon string guitar. We use the tres. Tres is a double, it's like a normal guitar, but the strings are doubled on it. It's from Cuba, but it actually worked really well on this. It played the melody for a lot of it. We used accordion and fiddle. We used timbales, congas, shakers, and maracas. So in terms of the sound effects, like since it was a casino game, you press different buttons in order to increase your bet or decrease your bet. So in this case, we used these percussion instruments to increase the bet or decrease the bet, which worked well because they're not, since they're unpitched, they didn't end up clashing with the music in terms of key and harmony. So it's just like a little kind of flourish that could kind of work rhythmically in there. It was fine, like it worked out just fine for that. With the sound effects, we didn't want to interfere with the soundscape. And we used for the vocals, we used Spanish language. We pitch shifted things up an octave or 2, depending, and I'm going to go into depth on that. Different methods for vocal pitch shifting are to use the pitch shifter in Cubase or whatever sequencer you're using. This, a lot of times I find, ends up having a lot of audio artifacts. So I did end up using a lot of experimentation in order to find the best way to pitch shift things. Autotune was okay, but for me, Melodyne works the best because you have a 4-mint shift in Melodyne that allows you to really maintain the intelligibility, which for me is very important about it. Also, talking to other people, Serato pitching time is very highly recommended. Apparently it's the best. It costs $800, so I found out about this after I did this project, and I think I'm going to try that out next time. So you really want to preserve the 3K range of the frequency spectrum. When I do vocal pitch shifting, a lot of times I'll EQ to have additional 3K before I pitch shift it, in that way that when it's processed, it actually retains a little bit more of the 3K. I've tried EQing it afterwards, which doesn't work quite as well, I find. In terms of digitally processing sounds, when you're going to speed up and slow things down a whole lot, it's better to use a higher bit rate because the waveform is going to be sampled more frequently. So that way, if you slow it down, you're still going to have a lot more data for it to pull from. And so audio artifacts are not going to jump out as much, and you can mangle and manipulate things a lot more before you start really hearing those audio artifacts. And sometimes you have quacking and other digital artifacts. You definitely want to avoid. Chipmunk sounds may be desirable. If you're working in a chipmunk game, then by all means, use chipmunk sounds. So one very important thing about doing mobile games is that you do not want to annoy the user. Since you're using a really small speaker, it's really crucial to get the right mix in that 3K audio range. So I use Avantones. They're like these mix cubes, and they're actually specifically made to sound like bad, like they're not high quality. And then I have my really nice speakers as well. So I do most of my work on the nice speakers. And I always play it back through the small ones. I play it back on an iPad to make sure everything works right. And a lot of times, instruments like accordions and bagpipes jump out a whole lot with the smaller speaker. So you definitely want to try mixing those and recording those a little bit differently, along with the piercing stringed instruments and Middle Eastern instruments like the ney and the zurna. They're double reed instruments, and they pop out a lot. So a lot of times with those instruments, especially with accordion, I try miking the instrument from much further away, because then you're going to have a lot less of that direct sound. The sound is going to mellow a little bit more, and it'll sit in the mix a lot better. I always try to reduce the 3K range of the frequency spectrum for those instruments as well. I generally reduce it by about 3 to 6 dB in that range, and it brings it back enough and makes it so that you can listen to it over and over again, and it's not going to annoy you. So this game here is called A Night in Paris, and it's about a French jewel thief and the police officer that is trying to catch him. I wanted to show it to you because it's a mix of two different styles. As far as the tone, we discussed different options, but we ended up going with a sneaky Pink Panther style of music with a traditional French style and instrumentation. This included accordion and mandolin, as well as clarinet to fit the style of the game. So this is the idle loop that happens most of the time. Then when it bumps up to the spin loop, it actually adds like a layer of percussion on top. So here we have a different idle and spin loop combination here. It switches back and forth between these two to keep it all fresh. So next, I'll talk about the iterative process. When you're talking to your creative team, you definitely want to experiment and be creative. You don't want to get locked into the previous versions of things that, like a lot of times they'll temp it with a certain type of music that might work well, but you really definitely want to have an original sound for each project, so that you don't want to really make sure that you want to not get locked into this approaches to similar games. You want to have a back and forth with the client, and you want to present your approach with sketches. So I generally do like 3 sketches, about 30 seconds each, with different styles and different ideas that I have. A lot of times the client will come back and they'll be like, I really love sketch number 1, but I like the instrumentation of sketch number 2. So can we do a combination of those things? And then, it makes it really easy, and that opens up a whole channel of communication. So you talk a bit, and then you go forward with that combination of the different sketches that you guys have talked about. A lot of times I like to cross styles. So I use rhythms and instrument combinations from one genre and mix it with another genre. So similar to heavy metal rhythms being played on a cello, or what about adding a brass band on top of electronic music? That makes a really interesting sound. Give it a shot sometime. So this here is Adventure Time VR. And this was done by Cartoon Network. And we wanted to go with a really quirky sound. And this first level here takes place in a forest, so we ended up deciding on using woody instruments, like woodwind instruments. I used the bass clarinet. And it creates this really nice, warm, woody sound that works well for the forest. But also, one interesting thing is that we had a brass, the trumpet player on this, he played all the brass instruments. And when we were discussing this, he was like, so I could play this on the trumpet, but I also have a cornet. Like, I'm not a brass player. I don't really know what a cornet sounds like. And so he did a shot on the cornet, and it has this bolder, interesting, brassier sound that's very rich and full. It's different. The trumpet is a little bit more piercing, and it actually gave it more of an Eastern European brass sound that I associate with Eastern European brass music, and instead of just a traditional big band kind of sound. So this, if you can sometimes just tweak a couple of instruments like that in an otherwise ordinary setting, it will actually create a more unique sound. As you can tell, one person plays all the woodwinds, one person plays all the brass, and I play all the stringed instruments. And that way we can save a whole lot of money because, hey, you're only hiring 2 extra people, right? You don't have to pay me anymore. So. So you get the point. Thank you. So it was interesting. I was like doing auto-tune and pitch correcting on a lot of it. And it was interesting. Like you find this mix where it's like once you start pitch shifting it too much and fixing it, it sort of removes a little bit of the personality from it. And it actually like worked a little bit better when things weren't like 100% in tune. Maybe that's just a personal taste for me, but I felt like when I auto-tuned everything perfectly, it kind of lost a lot of the personality that it had before when things were just like a little bit off. Anyways. So with unique Foley, so I had to work on my towel mic technique. So I was working on this. It's a football VR game where you're throwing footballs, and the sounds were very generic, the whoosh sounds that I had. So I wanted to create some new ones. So I used the towel, whipping it by the microphone. And with this case, since there's so much air hitting it, you want to use a pop filter in order to minimize that. I'd recommend a large diaphragm condenser microphone for this type of stuff. Then I went ahead and manipulated the Foley element in Iris in the plugin, and I layered in a synth element as well. So with this quarterback snap game, it's a football game, and we had musical stingers that matched the key of the music. You also might want to check out, in terms of unique implementation, there's a game called Bastion, where the actual narrator of the game starts narrating what's happening, like, ooh, you're a bit low on health there, and saying all these funny things that actually really enhances the game. So check that out in terms of unique implementation. So this is quarterback snap. I was hired late in the development cycle. They had already hired someone else on. The music he wrote was very generic football, just like rock music, sounded like a garage band or something. It didn't sound right. It was generic, so we ended up going with this like Monday Night Football, like epic kind of sound with guitar, a little bit of guitar on top. And also the spatialization of the game was all wrong. Like you'd be throwing footballs and they would sound like they were coming from over here. So they pulled me in and I had to do a whole bunch of stuff to make the sounds and all the spatialization match. All right, so that's all, folks. Now it's time for a Q&A. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask?
Questions? Questions? All good. I ducked out for one moment, but I am curious, working in VR with the whole spatial music exploration, I don't know how much you touched on this, but, mixing that and experimenting with that, what was that whole process like?
So it's interesting. I've had multiple experiences with that. The first one I tried with the Adventure Time VR, which I did a whole entire spatial mix. I had, everything was still in front, but I definitely utilized the vertical plane, vertical axis, and had like bass instruments down here and like higher shakers and stuff up here. I felt like that worked really well for that particular game. Then I worked on another game that was like an epic space battle game where you're sort of flying under Star Destroyer type ships. It was not a Star Wars game, but since things could be fired at you from all different angles, it was so important to preserve the clarity of where shots are being fired at you, and that when I tried doing spatial music in that, it was actually kind of getting in the way a little bit of where all these different shots being fired at you were coming from. So we ended up just going with the stereo mix for that one. In terms of the football game, it was just stereo as well. We just thought that that would work the best.
Yeah, no, it's always interesting to hear the different perspectives on that. And then were you doing any implementation in middleware for those, or were those kind of things where you were passing off stems or off cues?
With Adventure Time, actually, they did all the implementation.
Mm-hmm.
The sound effects, they had 7 seasons worth of sound effects from the show. They gave them all the stems, so they could just cut out, and they had a million things to work with there. So they didn't really need me for that. The quarterback snap, yeah, I got into it a little bit. We were using Unity, and so I was just doing the spatialization in there.
Right.
And but there was no middleware being used at all.
Sure.
And I talked to the audio guy, and it was funny. I told him about. I talked to the lead programmer and told him where these different key centers were, and like which like little guitar riffs would work in which different place. And so it was sort of like if it was 30 seconds to a minute through, it would play these ones. And that it was a very simple version of like what his amazing software Elias does. It was like the crazy bare bones, like you know, just kind of scratching the surface of that type of implementation.
Good stuff. Other questions?
So for Adventure Time VR, did you end up using mono or stereo stems when you spatialized the music?
So what I did is I spatialized it in my sequencer. So actually, I wrote it in Cubase. Then Logic has an actual binaural panner in there. So I took the stems into Logic and then mixed in there using their binaural panner, and then just exported stereo, and then they just implemented the stereo. So that way it was not using any of the CPU intensive like processes or anything like that. It was all just baked in, and it just made it so that it just played it straight through. And as simple as playing a stereo file, it just happens to be for the headphones. The mix, when I listen to it without headphones, it sounds a little funny. You don't really get the spatialization. When you listen to it with headphones, it's like, yeah, that's how it's supposed to sound, you know. So, awesome. But you know, when people are playing that game, they're wearing headphones. So, yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Sure.
That's cool. I don't know people who have really kind of done the binaural mix pre-game and then rendered it down. That's neat. Something maybe we should all be doing to save on performance.
Yeah, it worked great for that. And they didn't have to do anything. They just dropped it in.
Sure.
Thanks, guys. Thanks a lot.